Hello, welcome to Helmsley Castle, History Around Us. This is going to take you all the way around the site, looking at some photographs and some key history of the different parts of the Helmsley Castle site. It's like a little virtual tour around the site, just to remind you of some of the key places. And this is going to be particularly useful for you thinking about how to embed site evidence, physical site evidence into your work. So firstly, just show you around the castle and some of the main places. Just a reminder that in medieval times, they made people walk all the way around the castle and then enter the castle via the south entrance. So you can see the south barbican there, drawbridge across to the south gate, then into the main parts of the castle. The bailey was divided into two. There's a wall between the west tower and the east tower in original times. You can see some of the distinctive features where the great hall was, for example, where the chamber block is, the latrine tower, the west tower, the north gatehouse and the barbican in the far end of the picture. You've got the iconic east tower. You've got location of Helmsley to the east of the castle there, site of where the chapel was as well, and then you can see obviously the distinctive earthworks, the double ditch earthworks, which were so unique for castles at this time, and obviously associated with Walter Espes's castle as well. Okay, this map just gives you a really good indication of the different stages of the development of Helmsley Castle. So you can see here colour coded when the different parts of the castle were built, and it gives you a sense of how the castle developed over time. So some concluding points for that. Little remains from Espes's castle. We can just see that original wall which divided Espes's two baileys that remains, and that's colour coded in red. Much of the physical remains that we can actually see in the site date from the time of the renovations of Robert de Roos II, Robert Furzan, between 1190 and 1227. The South Barbican and the chapel were both built later on in the 13th century, and that kind of makes sense that those bits were kind of added once the sort of real strong kind of defensive element of the castle was built originally. In green, you can see a lot of the sort of domestic renovations, and you can see some of the additions to the South Barbican that were added from the open-backed Barbican in the 14th century. The wing walls, which were used to kind of really bring the South Barbican into the rest of the castle, and some of the changes to things like the West Tower during that time as well. You can see in the northwest part of the castle, in the blue, the second service area, which developed in the late 15th or early 16th century. And then in purple, we can see colour-coded some of those Tudor kind of changes in the 16th and early 17th century. So you've got things like the Long Gallery, the Loggia, the Tudor Mansion, for example, and the renovations to the chapel and a possible stable that we think might have existed in the northeast part of the castle. But there's no real site evidence left of that now, and of course some of the renovations at the South Barbican as well. So it just gives you a really good overview of how the castle developed through time. Okay, so we'll start off just by talking about the castle ditches. So it's a key characteristic of the site. They may even predate Walter Espes's time, but they're an essential part of the early castle. Earth was excavated from ditches, and they were used to build the ramparts, which you can see there as the ramparts. The double ditch earthworks provide site evidence to help us imagine Espes's castle and remain a really distinctive feature of the castle throughout its history. So we're seeing here from the north part of the castle, and you can see there the edge of the west tower, and you can see the east tower in the distance there. Now there is some site evidence that a ditch to the north of the castle was lined with clay, so it may have held water, so there may have been a moat, but apart from that we think probably the ditches to the castle would have been dry. Okay, so another view of the castle ditches from the west range, and you can see there some of the distinctive features of it. Okay, so let's start off with the South Barbican. So this was the way in which people would enter the castle originally. So we can see that this artistic interpretation is from around about the year 1300. So it was an impressive military entrance to the castle, built in the early 13th century under Robert Furzan de Roos. You can see there was a stone curtain wall, 4 D-shaped towers and a gate. Now the towers of the Barbican would originally have had arrow slits. Some would have been enlarged to form windows, which is a reminder of some of the domestic changes. The upper parts of the walls included a row of rectangular holes to hold timber beams, which supported a projecting wooden fighting gallery, which is known as a hoard, and you can see that hoard there on the top. Now that obviously doesn't survive, but we have got site evidence for that through those rectangular holes where we can see those timber beams would have been slotted in to hold the weight of the hoard. Now, the original 13th century gate arch remains aligned towards the east tower, and naturally people were there for your line of sight as you go into the castle is on the east tower, and that's obviously one of the most significant and most powerful features of the castle. Now, the South Barbican was remodelled in the 14th century, and we can see site evidence for this. So just where the arrow is pointing there's filling in between the towers. Note the sandstone, note the different colour of the stone, which shows that this was built later to sort of join the two D-shaped towers together and to sort of bring the South Barbican, make it sort of bigger. Today you can also see rectangular holes and slots, which would have been the drawbridge mechanism. Now, the South Barbican was originally open-backed, which is very common for Barbicans at that time. The North Barbican was also open-backed, and that basically means that it's just a shell of a building, it's just a wall, there's no rooms on it. But in the 14th century, changes were made which basically saw the building added to and chambers created on the back of the South Barbican within the towers as lodging for the steward or the constable of the castle. Site evidence of the wall footings can still be seen, as well as evidence of a fireplace and a latrine for that domestic comfort. We can also see graffiti on the walls of the South Barbican as well. Now, the choice of the medieval warrior statues put up in the 1990s adds the sense of the South Barbican's military purpose, and there's actually 3 of these statues that were put up and are quite kind of iconic and sort of symbolise that military background and military purpose of the castle originally. Now, if you go on to have a look at the South Gate, so not a lot of the South Gate survives, but it would have been a rectangular tower at the time. So the South Gate was one of the entrances to the Inner Bailey in the 12th century of the castle of Robert de Roos II, Robert de Roos Furzan. The gatehouse was obviously ruined now. The South Gate was remodelled when the South Barbican was added in the 13th century. We can see a modern bridge that was put in the 20th century to allow safe access onto the site. But originally there would have been a drawbridge there, so again that's useful for was to think about defensive purposes. And the site evidence too of the 14th century wing walls, which were added to link the South Barbican with the Inner Bailey curtain wall. And you can see there just some of the features: West Tower, East Tower, the actual South Gate itself, the site of the old drawbridge, and then the sort of walls out to the what are called the wing walls, which link the South Barbican onto the main part of the castle. Okay, so moving into the castle, we go to the kitchen, the buttery and the pantry area. Now, these buildings date from the 14th century and they reflect the increased domestic use of the castle as lords developed what were called retainers and had a more baronial role to have an increased household, increased number of servants, increased number of people living inside the castle. So they almost certainly replaced similar buildings at the time, but it just reflects that modernisation, increased domestication of the castle in the 14th century. Now, the kitchen contained a large fireplace for cooking and was located near to the Great Hall for convenience. Next to the kitchen were the buttery and the pantry where food and drink would have been stored before being served. Now, the stairs in the buttery area led to the basement of the tower, which was where drink was stored. And beyond the chapel lay a low arch structure that covered the medieval well, which was the only source of water in the castle. So there you see a view along the southwest, along the kitchen range. A senior household servant would have sat in the room beyond the window inspecting food before it was taken to the Great Hall. So that leads us on to the Great Hall. There's an artistic interpretation of the Great Hall from the 14th century. It was built around about 1300, presumably replacing an earlier hall. It was where the household dined and great feasts were held. The site evidence of its size suggests it was aisled with columns to support the roof, as you can see within this artistic interpretation. The lord and his relatives, so in this case the de Roos family, and if you look really carefully you can see the de Roos heraldic symbol with the 3 water bougies there, which is typical of the de Roos family. They would have sat on a raised timber platform, which was known as dais, and there was a doorway in the west corner, which we no longer can see site evidence for, but that would have provided private access from the West Tower, which was the main place where the Lords of Helmsley actually lived themselves, their own private chambers. In the centre there was an open central hearth with a fire venting through a louvre, which is an opening in the roof. There's no chimney, and that was again very common in medieval times. So we move on to where we can see here. If you're looking at here, you can see just in front of the West Tower, that is the remains of the footings of the Great Hall. So you can get a sense of the size of the Great Hall and how big it would have been, but that's obviously ruined now. We can't see much more evidence for that. So this is a view of the West Tower, and the space in front, as like we said, is where the Great Hall used to be. Now, the lower portion of the West Tower was built between 1190 and 1200 by Robert de Roos, and if you have a look on the building, you can see where it was heightened a little bit later on. There's an example of a solar tower, a singular tower. It was built partly over Walter Espet's 12th century wall, which divided his north and south bailey. Now, the west tower was heightened in the 14th century, and the southwest wall was rebuilt over a little bit over the ditches, and the tower was remodelled inside in the 16th century to insert an additional floor by lowering the 14th century floor levels. The main use of the west tower was private rooms for the Lord of Helmsley and his family. Now, if you go inside the west tower, the basement contains a pair of peacock heads, which is an emblem of the Roos family, and the final bay of the vault was added in the 14th century. The upper floors of the west tower were remodelled in the 16th century with large mullioned windows, again reflecting that domestic role, which you can see there, and central fireplaces. So you can see those fireplaces, and they give you a good perspective on the different sort of floor layout and different sort of room layout. A ground floor level, a 12th century fireplace incorporating a keeping hole, which is a place to keep items dry, can be seen. And evidence can be seen of sockets which support the timber beams for 16th century floors. Okay, moving on to the East Tower. It's built by Robert the Roos II. Ferzan is intended as the great symbol of power. The main room would have been a receiving room and used to conduct state business and legal affairs. The East Tower is very much more the administrative basis of the castle, not used for sort of private rooms or anything like that, not as the residence of the Lords of Helmsley. That was, of course, the West Tower. The doorway in the southeast wall facing the south gate would have been the public entrance. Now, the East Tower was heightened in the 14th century, and you can see this really clearly on the castle. You can see that in that picture. The site evidence of the use of yellow sandstone shows this. So you can see a slight difference in the type of stone being used, and these very distinctive what are known as ear turrets were added onto the East Tower as a decorative feature. Now, a further vault was added in the 14th century, dividing the 12th century upper room into two levels, but a serious fire in the 14th century meant the timber floor of the upper chamber was replaced with a stone vault. Now, the East Tower was originally D-shaped, so it would have had a circular kind of end to it, but obviously during the English Civil War and the siege of Helmsley Castle, the East Tower was slighted. We've got some really strong evidence that we can see that. Site evidence helps us to understand the impact of this event. There is some remains of the debris from the blast just next to the East Tower, which tells the story of what happened. A lack of pockmarks on the walls of the East Tower suggests there was actually very little firing of weapons during the actual siege itself. Okay, so moving on to the chapel. So the chapel was consecrated in 1246 and it forms the northeast enclosure wall of Robert de Roos II's central court. The chapel is orientated east to west along its main axis, which is very common with churches. Consecrated in 1246, so it was built by that date. The site evidence suggests the chapel was highly decorated. When the chapel was excavated, decorative floor tiles were found, as well as painted window glass, suggesting there were stained glass windows, and that artistic interpretation gives you a good idea about what the chapel would have looked at inside. The bases of angle buttresses survive on two corners, and part of a moulded jamb of a tall window survives in the southeast corner. So that reminds us of the religious use of the castle. Now, moving on to the chamber block, so next to the West Tower. So the chamber block is that bit there in the middle between the West Tower and the latrine tower. So the origins of the chamber block were a 12th century chamber block itself, and that's similar to the one at Scarborough Castle actually. Now, the building's current appearance is due to the remodelling by Edward Manners, which was completed in 1582, into a Tudor mansion. Now, the former chamber block was redesigned as a series of state apartments. The first floor had a great chamber or dining room and a more private room, and the first floor long gallery was built to link the chamber block and the chapel. Now, some medieval buildings like the hall were probably demolished and materials reused, while additional material was obtained from Revo Abbey. And then you can just see there an artistic interpretation which gives you a little bit of a sense of what the Tudor mansion would have looked like. What doesn't still exist now is the loggia, which is that kind of like covered walkway area, and the long gallery no longer exists, but you can see just there on the right hand side some of the footings from that building there as site evidence for you. Okay, so this just again helps you to imagine that same kind of picture, but just think about the different places. The West Tower, the original doorway. B, C, the doorway from the first floor onto what would have been the loggia balcony. D, the base of the medieval chimney. E, footings of the steps that led onto the loggia balcony. F, the chamber block, footings of the Elizabethan long gallery. And H, the latrine tower. So there you have it, a little bit more site evidence for you. Now, a little glimpse inside the Tudor mansion. You can see the ornamental plasterwork on the ceiling, the fireplace, very ornate, very decorative, and the wood panelling. The interior of the Tudor mansion now, its purpose is to hold a museum about the castle. It's the only bit of the castle that's really particularly intact. During the time of Edward Manners, the ground floor was divided into 3 rooms by timber and plaster partitions. The Tudor mansion contains decorative and ornamental features. Now, the fireplace in the northeast wall was dated around about 1582, was decorated with polygonal panels with knots and roses. The decorative plasterwork, impressive fireplaces and heraldic frieze emphasises the high status of the room and the impressive statement that Edward Manners and his wife Isabel Holcroft wanted to make. Just remember that their main residence was in Belvoir Castle over in Rutland, Leicestershire, so this wasn't their main residence, but obviously they still wanted to make a good impression through Helmsley Castle. Okay, latrine tower was remodelled several times. It was originally built by Robert de Roos II, contained private latrines serving the chamber block. In the 14th century, the interior was remodelled to provide a pair of latrines that can still be seen today. So that's a bit of site evidence again for you. In the 16th century, both the northeast and northwest walls were largely dismantled and rebuilt, creating a much larger tower with rooms on 3 floors. And again, that domestic purpose of the castle. We now move to what's called the second service area, which is the brew house and the bakehouse. So this was built in either the 15th or the early 16th century. The bakehouse contained a large bread oven, again reinforcing the domestic role of the castle. The brew house lies next to the latrine tower and had 2 settings for copper boilers. Okay, and last but not least, the northern curtain walls and the north barbican. So a little bit of site evidence for this. Okay, the northern curtain walls date from Robert de Roos II's time, now ruined, but site evidence shows the footings and base of what would have been a very impressive facade. The north gate consisted of 2 D-shaped towers. The modern timber bridge replaces a drawbridge. The north barbican was added in the 13th century and consisted of a pair of drum towers flanking a central passage. The north barbican was open back and never ever had a residential function, unlike the south barbican, and the abutment for a drawbridge can still be seen on the outer ditch. A reminder that the north barbican was not the main entrance to the castle. It was an impressive military facade, but in medieval times people would go through the south entrance. So that just gives you an overview of the history of Helmsley Castle, the different owners, the different purposes, and the different key stages of the castle. Thanks very much for listening. That little tour around Helmsley Castle. Hope that was useful. Goodbye.